right, good morning, everyone. My name is Mande Muyango, and I'm the director of the Africa program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I want to welcome you to what promises to be an engaging and productive session on peace-building architectures and institutions in Africa, what works. At the Wilson Center, we seek to provide a space for inclusive dialogue and analysis to better inform policy debates on pressing global issues. And for the Africa program, that means with a specific focus on Africa. And over the last several decades, Africa has been at the heart of peace-building efforts. And the Wilson Center continues to work on this issue that is of such critical importance to the continent. In this regard, since 2011, the Carnegie Corporation of New York has funded the Africa Programs project called the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding, a network of 22 policy and research organizations working in the peacebuilding space in Africa. The project aims to bring African analyses and perspectives to international policymaking and decisions on peacebuilding on the continent. Thus, the SVNP, as we call it for short, provides avenues for African researchers to engage with, inform, and exchange perspectives with US and international policymakers in order to develop the most appropriate, cohesive, and inclusive policy frameworks for issues of peace building and state building in Africa. So this is a way, if you will, of giving African voice on issues that impact them on a day-to-day basis. This week, we are hosting the annual Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding Conference, and we have many of the leaders of the network with us here in Washington. As part of this annual conference, we'll be offering 3 public sessions, of which this is the first, where our African colleagues can offer their perspectives and engage with you, US policymakers, academics, and practitioners on critical issues in peacebuilding in Africa and in US-Africa relations. Our first session this morning will focus on peacebuilding architectures and institutions and analyze what's working well and what needs to be improved. However, before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to recognize a number of special guests that we have in the audience here today. First and foremost, all the directors, senior leaderships, and representatives from the Southern Voices Network for Peacebuilding organization for peacebuilding. We welcome you to Washington. There are also members of the African Diplomatic Corps. I welcome you as well. We welcome the funders for this project, Ms. Andrea Johnson and Aaron Stanley of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, as well as members of the Africa Program Advisory Council. I know that we also have many people joining us remotely, and I welcome you as well. I'd like to note that for those of you on Twitter, you can follow the live tweets of today's event by following the Africa Program's Twitter account, @AfricaUpClose, all one word, and you can contribute to this dialogue using the hashtag #PeacebuildingWhatWorks, all one word. As I mentioned earlier, the theme of this session, Peacebuilding Architectures, Institutions in Africa, What Works? It is intended to look at the effectiveness of African and international peacebuilding architectures in meeting Africa's needs. What are the key lessons that we have learned over the past few decades of peacebuilding in Africa? What is working well, and what are the key challenges? How well is Africa's peacebuilding architectures articulating with international peacebuilding architectures and institutions? We hope to come away from this session with concrete and practical recommendations for enhancing the effectiveness of Africa's peacebuilding approaches. And so we have asked each of our speakers to be as forward-leaning as possible in offering practical recommendations for making such improvements. We have 3 very good speakers, 2 from the African continent and 1 offering an international perspective to initiate the discussion for us this morning. And I'll introduce them in the order in which they will speak. Our first speaker is Mr. Gustavo De Carvalho, who is a senior researcher focusing on peace operations and peace building at the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa. And we have asked him to look at the African Union, the United Nations peacebuilding architectures and institutions, how well they're working individually and together, and to highlight some of the key challenges and to offer his recommendations for the way forward. Our next speaker will be Dr. Ibrahim Wani, who is an independent consultant here in Washington, D.C. He previously served as the director of the Human Rights Division at the UN mission in South Sudan, UNMISS, and also as a representative of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in the Republic of South Sudan. He will look at how current peacebuilding architectures and institutions are addressing human rights issues, the challenges to safeguarding human rights during various phases of peacebuilding, and also offer his recommendations for the way forward. Our third and final speaker is Professor Gnarnia Bola Muller, who is the Executive Director of the Democracy, Governance, and Service Delivery Research Program at the Human Science Research Council in South Africa. She will look at whether the Rome Statute, otherwise known as the International Criminal Court, is interfering with peacebuilding in Africa. Each of our speakers will offer initial remarks for 8 minutes, and after all three of them have spoken, we will then open it up to a moderated Q&A period so that we can engage all of you in the discussion. With that, Gustavo, your 8 minutes start now.
Thank you very much, Monde. Thank you very much first to Monde, but also to the Woodrow Wilson Center for this opportunity to share some thoughts of where is peacebuilding architecture in Africa, both in terms of the role of the United Nations, but particularly with the emerging role that the African Union plays as a leader in the continent in discussions around peace and security matters. There are high expectations what peacebuilding can offer in the continent. We've seen in the last 15 years the African Union generating and establishing a stronger African peace and security architecture with increased participation in peace support operations, increased demands for participation of the African Union on post-conflict reconstruction and development, but also the acknowledgement of the Continental organization that they have and Africans have to become more engaged in strengthening the architecture for governance in Africa. But we've also seen in the last 15 years increasing participation of UN, not only through its more traditional peacekeeping operations, but also through demands of peacebuilding processes, through the establishment of the peacebuilding architecture of the UN, including the Peacebuilding Support Office, the Peacebuilding Commission, and the Peacebuilding Fund. But also the role that the UN agencies, funds, and programs play to directly support peacebuilding processes in Africa. But another reason why we have high expectations for peacebuilding in Africa at the moment is that both institutions are engaged within an intrinsic process of reflection of where they sit around that. The reflection talks about not only in terms of the new leadership of the two organizations that have new Secretary General and a new chairperson of the African Union, in terms of how do we make the responses of the international community to conflicts in Africa more effective. And the idea of effectiveness is core here. We have 7 reforms ongoing at the United Nations at the moment, from reform of the UN peace and security architecture, reform of the management systems, of development systems, and we could continue naming them. But we also have a very important reform process regarding the African Union Commission that tries to make it more effective and more streamlined to respond to the challenges that we have in Africa. And all of those, what they tell us about is that it's not about us doing more activities, to doing more responses, to doing more intervention. It's about doing the ones that we have better. And in a way, peace building starts becoming married to a lot of different definitions and approaches. So we don't see peace building so much more in isolation to what we consider to be sustaining peace or conflict prevention. And all of those ideas are becoming far more powerful within a political rhetoric and interchangeable many times within the political rhetoric, but it's still challenges around making them practically strong. So where is the debate around peace building now, or where does it lie? And I generally like doing speech analysis in international organizations because it really tells where politicians are taking their conversation forward. So if we see in terms of some of the speeches that have been done this year around peace building, speeches talk about conflict being too expensive, that prevention and peace building is not only morally right, but also the smart, economically sound, and sustainable thing to do. And there is evidence coming from research that says that for every dollar spent on prevention and peace building, the cost of conflict will be reduced in $16 over the long run. So even with such a compelling argument, it's still very difficult to persuade member states to bring prevention and peace building to the core. So what I wanted to do in the next 4 minutes of my presentation is really just to talk first about some of the key trends that we see within this debate around making peace building and prevention far more cost effective, and 3 ideas that I have in terms of where do we need to take the field forward. The first of them is that there is an issue around mindset. There is an issue regarding seeing responses to conflict in a very linear way. And that starts and is very much from the 1990s discussions, that starts in terms of the discussions around where does peacemaking sits, where does peacekeeping sits, where does peace building sits, that each of them had their own place within different aspects of the conflict spectrum. The current debate tries to tell that we need to provide, to identify the root causes of conflicts in every single stage of a conflict, before, during, and after. The peacekeeping operations and peace building process and mediation often happen at the same time. But in order to understand that the responses are not very linear, our own policymakers need to start mandating responses in a far less linear and comprehensive way. And there is an indication of the challenges around about dealing with linearity. We still focus our responses very much from a reactive point of view. If we compare budgets, and it's a very simplistic way of presenting these arguments, but it's also a very visible way of the United Nations and the African Union in terms of their responses. If we talk about the UN peacekeeping budget, now even with the reduced budget of peacekeeping budget from 2 weeks ago, we're still talking about plus minus $7 billion a year. The Peace Building Fund alone, and of course it's not the only UN institution working on peace building, has a budget of around $300 to $400 million a year. You see that disparity. Similar within the African Union context, where a mission like the African Union mission in Somalia has a budget of $1 billion a year, there's close to zero budget to engage on peace building matters from the AU Commission. But another issue regarding to engagements around peace building reflects the institutional fragmentation of the field. Differently from a peacekeeping operation that it's mandated by the Security Council or by the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, where we know where it starts, we know where it ends. Peace building is a process. Peace building is a goal. Therefore, many different institutions are operating at the same time. So there are a lot of conversations and discussions about strengthening the relationship between the UN, the African Union, the regional economic communities on peace building issues. But it's still something that it has to be far more strengthened, especially when we're starting to move beyond just peacekeeping operations as our point of interaction. So where should we go in terms of identifying more effective responses for peace building? And I wanted to bring 3 core issues for you. The first one is that we need to identify benchmarks of success much better. We need to identify how we sustain engagements, how do we pace them, how do we fund them, and particularly how do we manage expectations. We need to understand, and events like this from the Southern Voices Network is very important. What works in peace building? What are the initiatives? What are the experiences? And there is, to a large extent, a lot of processes happening both at the African Union side and at the UN side, trying to identify what works better. Because one thing is to say that we have the tools, and we do have those tools. We have a very sound post-conflict reconstruction and development, which is the African Union language for peace building, but it's still very little implementation. We have an increasingly broader peace building architecture at the UN, but it's still with very limited reach. The second thing, and I know I'm reaching the end of my presentation, is the idea of timing of interventions. We talk about being able to respond timely to conflict situations, but it's still the key question of how early do we intervene? When is the right time, and what are the correct mechanisms? Because by reflecting on that question would ensure that the international community, including the African Union and the United Nations, will not only intervene when an issue is hot, but also enable them to sustain responses in terms of intensity. And the final issue, and probably the most important of them all, is that it's very easy to blame bureaucracies for their own limitations. But at the same time, member states of each of the institutions and partners need to have an effort to be able to empower those organizations. They need to be on board to ensure that those organizations are able to do what they expect them to do in terms of their own objectives. And to empower an international organization is not to delegate some kind of sovereignty. To empower that is to acknowledge that common goals are effectively achieved through shared responsibilities. Because we often try to make peace building, conflict prevention, or any of the terminology that we use in terms of responses, sometimes it's a very technical process. We try to create strong technical early warning systems, technical planning, and often a very activity-oriented process. But those processes are intrinsically political, and therefore they require far more political support. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gustavo. I think you hit on a number of very, very important points, and I like that you just went boom, boom, boom through the issues that we had asked you to speak to, so thank you very much for that. Dr. Wani, the human rights and peace building perspective.
Okay, is
I think you're on.
Okay. Thank you very much, Monde, and thanks to the Wilson Center for the invitation. Good morning, everyone. I've been asked to talk about the human rights dimension of peacekeeping, the peacekeeping architecture, how it has worked, what are the key issues, what are the challenges. In the short time that I have, I think I'm just going to be hitting the highlights and leave some of the details for our subsequent discussions. First, just as a general point, I think that this conversation about human rights is in many ways also a conversation about the success of peacekeeping more generally, for reasons that I will outline later. So some of the key issues that I raise here apply equally more broadly to the broader question of how peacekeeping has been effective or not in addressing some of the key objectives. Let me start first of all with the positive. I think that
Just need to scoot this up closer to you.
over the last 15 years or so, there has been a lot of progress in focusing on issues of human rights as an element of peace and security, and integrating human rights in the work of UN peacekeeping missions. If you look at all of the peacekeeping missions today, every single one of them has a very, very detailed mandate related to the monitoring, investigation, and reporting on human rights. Every single human rights component, peacekeeping mission today has a human rights component in many missions, including the one where I served. It is among the largest within the mission. There is a long list of normative frameworks and policies that have been adopted, most of them beginning around 2000, for reasons that I think for those who follow the issues closely will be fairly obvious, including policies on protection of civilians in peacekeeping missions, the human rights in peace missions. Most of these are internal, but also project more generally. The Rights Upfront initiative, which was only about 2-3 years ago in the aftermath of Sri Lanka. You will recall when the United Nations decided that human rights was going to be the preeminent area of focus in its work. The responsibility to protect, which has been adopted very much as a core dimension of policy. And at the regional level as well, the Constitutive Act of the African Union, for those who have analyzed it fairly closely, is actually quite human rights friendly. There's a long list of norms that relate to the significance of human rights as an element of peace and security in the African continent. The Continental Early Warning System, part of the AU, as well puts the element of prevention as a core dimension, and it focuses on issues of mass atrocities, of human rights violations, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and so on. So from the policy and normative framework, certainly, we do have an abundance of norms and standards, which in many ways reflects also I think the growing awareness of an acknowledgement of the importance of human rights. Now, this development is driven by a lot of factors, but I think the primary one was Rwanda and Srebrenica. You will recall that the UN walked away from Rwanda just as the genocide was about to begin. And that clearly was a tremendous blemish on the United Nations in particular, but also globally. And from that moment on, there's been a resolve, the refrain that we have heard of, never again, that has been repeated over and over since the Rwanda genocide. But in many ways also, it is a recognition of the reality of conflict. The fact that during the last 20, 30 years, almost all of the key conflicts in which we have deployed peacekeeping missions have been accompanied by really phenomenal human rights violations. You know, you look at Liberia, Sierra Leone, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, South Sudan, of course, Darfur, every single one of them. Human rights as a cause, but also human rights as an outcome as a result of the conflict. And so in many ways, I think it is inevitable that we would be focusing on this, not only from the point of view of dealing with the consequences of human rights, but also as a critical dimension of efforts to respond to peace and security issues. Now, the key question then here is, how has it worked? How has it worked in practice? I'm afraid I'm a little bit pessimistic here, maybe jaded a little bit by my experience in South Sudan, where from the beginning of the conflict in December 2013 to date, I must say, there has been very, very little real difference. And one could not argue, could not make a case about the impact that the United Nations peacekeeping mission has had on minimizing the human rights violations in the country. And I must say, one could say the same of Central African Republic. The DRC, decades later, we still continue to face very serious human rights problems. Mali, to a lesser extent. Cote d'Ivoire has had similar issues. So we have a real dilemma here where, on the one hand, the international community has made a resolve to address issues of human rights. Issues go up to the level of the Security Council. There are extensive discussions. Human rights reports are presented. But at the same time, this is accompanied by more and more horrendous reports of human rights violations in many, many instances. In fact, when you look at human rights reports from South Sudan, from the DRC, from Central African Republic, and so on, Darfur, most of them, according to at least those who are reporting, whether within the UN system or outside, amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity, which, according to some of the norms and standards that have been adopted here, should trigger some more serious action. Now, to a large extent, what we get to see are reports that go to the Security Council, extensive discussions that are held, and I must say, as someone on the ground who was constantly trying to deal with these issues, the most that the Security Council has been able to do is issue condemnations with stronger and stronger adjectives with every single resolution or statements of the President of the Security Council, but really no tangible action on the ground. Now, what are the reasons for this? There are many, but let me highlight maybe 4 or 5. First, I think that this is one of a challenge with peacekeeping missions more generally. The agenda of peacekeeping missions is extremely crowded. Since the Brahimi report, when we adopted this notion of a holistic approach to peacekeeping, which is, in a sense, a realistic response to situations on the ground, we've ended up in situations where most missions have mandates that cover 17 to 20 areas, 40 to 50 tasks, all of them to be accomplished within a very, very short time frame and with very limited budgets. So every single component of the mission is struggling for that limited resource, struggling for political attention, struggling for priority. You talk about a budget of 1 billion, it doesn't actually translate to much on the ground because most of that budget is spent on personnel costs, on air transportation, logistics, and so on, because in the majority of cases where you have peacekeeping missions, conditions on the ground are very poor. And so we spend a lot of money on helicopters from Ukraine and the former Soviet republics, and vehicles that break down every 6 months and so on, lifespans of about 2 to 3 years. Very, very little actually put down to programming. So there's that struggle for resources. But from the point of view of human rights also, I think on the ground, the leadership of the United Nations is not quite comfortable with the idea of human rights. I've had many, many instances where I'm even excluded from meetings because they do find it very uncomfortable when you raise human rights issues. In some respect, human rights is considered to contradict or maybe even undermine some of the other mission objectives, particularly the political ones. So from the point of view of priority, certainly a very serious issue. Secondly, I think even though globally we've made quite an advance, there is still quite an ambiguity about the concept of human rights itself. I think there's still a lot of way to go to get a convergence on what the notion of human rights means in practice. A lot of people on the ground still perceive human rights from a very, very scary perspective. It is subversive, it is dangerous, it is something that is accusatory, and so on and so on. And so we are not yet at that point where one could argue that there is coherence and convergence. And that reflects itself a little bit more in the African continent in particular, where you have hybrid missions and partnership between the United Nations, the African Union, and regional, sub-regional organizations like IGAD and so on. We have situations where even though the African Union's general framework acknowledges human rights, the African peace and security architecture actually doesn't embrace it at all. And so we've had situations where the AU is operating in a manner quite inconsistent with what the norms and standards do provide, and that makes for a very, very complicated relationship, particularly if you are attempting to try to translate things on the ground. Then there is the issue of the tools. One of the key challenges for human rights people on the ground is, what do you do with questions of human rights violations? At best, what we do is write reports. We publish those reports publicly. Arguably, when you issue a public report, it has a deterrent effect. But the reality on the ground is that in almost every one of the situations where human rights peacekeeping missions are on the ground, the primary protagonists are beyond redemption. These are not people who understand notions of deterrence. In fact, in many, many cases, we present reports and you go to try to discuss it with them because internally it's required that before you issue a report, you present it to the government and to others. You find that they have not even read them and they don't bother. And I think it is even more dangerous when the Security Council, in particular at the end of the day, ends up issuing threats that are not followed through, because that then undermines situation on the ground, and I think it encourages even more intransigence on their parts. So in the 1 minute left, what recommendations can I make? I think that the key recommendation I would make here is to continue the effort to build up on some of the accomplishments that have been made. The normative framework is extremely good. I think there are policies on the ground that make real sense. There is a big challenge in trying to operationalize some of these concepts and principles. And so there are two dimensions to this. On the one hand, continuing to work on these mindset issues, really getting a better understanding of the importance of human rights and its relevance as a critical dimension of peace and security on the one hand, but also for the technical people to try to develop a better understanding and to try to continue promotional work on human rights, particularly in developing the concepts. I think the issue of coherence is extremely important at all levels, global, regional, sub-regional. We take it for granted that everybody talks the language of human rights today, but the reality, I think, contradicts that. We need to continue to work on that and to put pressure. And finally, on the issue of tools, I think it's extremely important that we begin to look more closely at what tools beyond the issuings of reports and condemnations we can have in place. The Security Council in particular, in my view, has not performed very well in this regard. There are a lot of political issues that I think undermine the ability of the Security Council to be able to take effective action. But I must say it is not just a question of the rest of the world versus Russia and China. I think globally almost all members of the Security Council are unclear about the relationship between human rights and politics. And political expedience in most cases does in fact trump the agenda of human rights. And I think we need a lot more accountability in that regard. And I think that the Security Council really does need to step up on the plate and take its responsibility a lot more boldly. And consider, if you face a situation where a country, the human rights situation continues to be as dire as it is, you have cases, I mean, South Sudan today, probably 50% of the population of the country is either displaced internally or outside the country. And you hear reports of human rights violations almost every single week. I think the failure of the Security Council to take any decisive means in that regard undermines the international peace and security agenda as a whole. So there isn't really anything profound I can suggest here. It is simply a question of a lot more effort on this. And I must say, as someone who has worked in this area since the 1970s, it sounds frustrating and very negative in many respects, but I must also say there's been a tremendous amount of progress if you look back historically. That should give us cause to continue to work harder. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Wani. So thank you once again for, as always and as expected, going straight to the issues and putting them in very clear terms and getting directly to the heart of the issues. I really appreciate that. Dr. Wani was a boss of mine about 25 years ago. He hasn't lost a step. So thank you for that. So Gnarnia, I think Dr. Wani has set up the stage for you really well.
Yes.
Can you tell us whether the International Criminal Court is undermining peace building in Africa?
Thank you very much, Mundi and the Southern Voices Network for welcoming me here. And yes, Dr. Wani has assisted. The issue of human rights versus political expediency, or peace versus justice, as some people call it, I think that there may be some false dichotomies here. I just want to say that the structure of my presentation would be looking at the context, and in this context, I'm going to be using the narrative of al-Bashir's visit to South Africa in 2015. Then South Africa's response, visceral response in terms of withdrawing, sending a notice of withdrawal, then withdrawing the notice of withdrawal, putting a repeal act into our parliament, and then withdrawing the appeal act. And then the whole argument in front of the trial court of the International Criminal Court about political solutions related to peacekeeping in Africa. So I wanted to start off just quickly with a quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower. I'd like to believe that people in the long run are going to do more to promote peace than our governments. Indeed, I think that people want peace so much that one of these days governments had better get out of the way and let them have it. Okay, I'm really skipping through this because of time issues. But for those of you, you probably do know this. Al-Bashir visited South Africa in 2015. And at this stage, the International Criminal Court requested South Africa, in line with the Rome Statute, to arrest him. What happened simultaneously was the South African Litigation Center approached the High Court in South Africa to issue a warrant for his arrest, and compliance with national law as provided for in the implementation of the Rome Statute of the ICC Act 27 of 2002. Very long name. So we have obligations towards the Rome Statute as a member state and obligations towards our own domestic laws that have domesticized the Rome Statute. The High Court then issued a warrant of arrest for al-Bashir, as it was held in this particular case, but he left South Africa despite the order of the High Court. So it went on to the Supreme Court of Appeal, where the court held that the conduct of the South African government in failing to execute the warrant for al-Bashir's arrest was inconsistent with South Africa's obligations in terms of the Rome Statute and Section 10 of our Domestic Act. On the 4th of September 2015, the ICC issued an order requesting submissions from South Africa as to why al-Bashir was permitted to leave the country. South Africa responded to the order, but purely to ask for to ask for an extension in order to respond properly. On the 19th of October, the response came where the Minister of International Relations signed a notice of withdrawal from the Rome Statute and deposited it with the Secretary General of the United Nations. This again went to court, and I'm not putting this in the presentation, but just quickly to say we're a very litigious society nowadays, South Africa, so this again went to court, and the court determined that this was unprocedural and unlawful, and therefore the withdrawal was invalid. This was accepted by government, and this is just the notice of withdrawal that was sent to the Secretary General of the United Nations. So it went to court, another court eventually, the International Criminal Court. So the ICC decided to convene a public hearing under Article 87, subsection 7 of the Rome Statute. What it wanted to know, two things: whether South Africa had failed to comply with its obligations, and if it had, should this be sent to the state parties or the United Nations Security Council. South Africa appeared before the ICC Pre-Trial Chamber 2, and we stated clearly that we did not have an obligation to arrest al-Bashir. Because, and this is the argument that I want to emphasize, from its own experience and involvement in international peacekeeping missions in Africa, and particularly in Sudan, the interrelated peace processes on a bilateral basis, including under AU mandates, has always expressed the view that to keep peace, one must make peace. This awareness is based on South Africa's direct involvement on the ground in peace efforts, including the enforcement of peace on the African continent where mandated. So in essence, South Africa was saying, if we want to continue our role in peacekeeping, peace building on the African continent, please do not ask us to arrest a sitting member of state. So the argument was that South Africa had no duty to arrest the sitting head of a non-state party, but of course this is a completely incorrect interpretation of the Rome Statute itself. And even if there was a duty, there was no cause to take this to the Security Council or the Assembly of State Parties. And again, this argument, as a lead player in peace efforts, we cannot disengage from the African Union or adopt a policy that would suggest that we are not going to host AU heads of state. It's just not possible. The government has consistently made its point to the Assembly of State Parties in our efforts to find a political solution. So far, that political solution has not been found, but we understand that it's continuing. But the political and diplomatic complexities are actually mirrored in this legal and judicial labyrinth. So, political power, arbitrary political power and populism. And this is an argument I want to make here. There are many ways of ending conflicts, and often political solutions lead to more political problems to which more political solutions must be sought. So in fact, protecting heads of state in situations such as this will not help to end conflict on the continent because of the issue of impunity. Why stop if nobody's going to stop you? It may in fact escalate conflict in some cases. This is why the rule of law is necessary. It counters the arbitrariness of politics, power, and populism. And this is, of course, the rule of law in relation to human rights and extreme human rights abuses. In the absence of effective African institutions to deal with serious crimes against African people by their own governments, the ICC will have to do for now. So on the 6th of July, the ICC passed judgment, and it used some strong wording, right? So you'll see in the first paragraph there, it states South Africa breached its international and domestic legal obligations when it failed to arrest al-Bashir. No state should follow this example. There must be no impunity for crimes under international law. That was Justice Bola. Secondly, By failing to execute the ICC's warrant, South African authorities took away a major opportunity from victims to achieve justice. What's most important now is such shameful failure is never repeated. South Africa must now put its weight behind international justice, which faces increasing global challenges. But the court decided not to refer this matter to the United Nations Security Council or the states parties, which was actually quite lenient because this has been done before in the case of Uganda and Kenya, for example. So I just want to say before I go through some of these issues is that South Africa's response to the court case has been relatively negative. And in fact, the governing party has stated that if the court doesn't want to recognize the necessity to focus more on political solutions than on issues of justice and human rights, then we may as well withdraw. So we're going through this whole argument again of withdrawal. And we seem to be one of the only countries who's consistently doing this at the moment because, of course, there was a reversal in Gambia. And recently there was a referendum in Zambia where 70 plus percentage of 70 plus people of the Zambian people stated that Zambia should remain a member of the International Criminal Court. So there are all these threats, and usually after, President Mugabe stands up and does his thing, that African countries should withdraw en masse. There has been discrimination against Africa in terms of the International Criminal Court and what it's doing. But I think it's important to note here that the court is taking note of this criticism. And there are concerted efforts to ensure that there is not this focus only on the African continent. But we must bear in mind that predominantly African countries have been referring these matters to the International Criminal Court themselves, or it's been going through the United Nations Security Council. Now, there is a problem with it going through the United Nations Security Council because some members of the Security Council are not members of the court. And this is one of the real areas of tension. And of course, we know that the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court. So, some recommendations. African countries who are members of the ICC and have ratified the Rome Statute should comply with the international rule of law. There's really no choice. Unless you have officially withdrawn, there must be respect for the international rule of law and, in fact, the rule of law in your own country. Careful consideration should be given to the rights of African people and the need to ensure that power is kept in check. So the second recommendation is that we should be very aware of power differentials on the continent and the fact that, as Eisenhower said, people want peace. And they may very well take on their governments if this peace continues to evade them. The third recommendation is African countries should make a concerted effort to strengthen the rule of law domestically and ensure a strong and independent judiciary that can deal with these issues. Because one of the reasons for referral to the ICC is because the local judicial system is not strong enough to deal with these serious issues. So it's very important for African countries to strengthen their judiciary and to ensure that the judiciary acts in an independent manner and is able to deal with these difficult situations, including dealing with heads of state. And at least in South Africa, we can say that our judiciary is not afraid of dealing with heads of state. So the fourth recommendation there is that Africa should create a regional criminal court. Lots of talk has happened around this, which is not ad hoc in nature and which would deal with serious violations of human rights. Bashir was the first sitting head of state who was charged with genocide, for example. So that was the most serious charge ever made against a head of state. So this issue of serious violations of human rights is very important. In Senegal, there was a tribunal that dealt with a situation of serious violations of human rights, but that was an ad hoc tribunal. So I don't think that it would be sufficient to set up ad hoc tribunals, because it could end up being done in an arbitrary manner, and targeting some of the easier cases and avoiding some of the harder cases. And then lastly, there has been a very strong argument that South Africa should not withdraw from the Rome Statute, as it would damage its reputation as a beacon of human rights. The terminology I'm using there, the beacon of human rights, is from our deceased president, Nelson Mandela, who, when speaking about South Africa's role on the continent, when speaking about South Africa's role in the world, focused very much on the fact that we could be an example to the rest of the world, to the rest of the continent, as to how to do things right. And yes, it may be slightly naive, and yes, we do need to take political considerations into account. But I think to some extent, if we continue to allow political expediency to trump human rights, then we're going to sort of find ourselves in a situation where we do not ever have peace.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Gnarnia. I think, again, touching on what is a very hot potato on the African continent, issues of impunity, particularly at the highest of political governance levels, the challenges that the ICC has had on the African continent, the lack of African capacity currently to address that impunity at those really high levels. So where do we go from here? I think three very, very good and powerful presentations. We will now open it up to Q&A, and just some rules of engagement. I'll take three questions, comments at a time. You have about a minute to make your comment. Please identify yourself and the institution with which you're affiliated, if any, and the speaker to whom you're directing your comment or question. And then we'll go from there. So the floor is open. All right, I'll start from the back there with Fred. Then I'll come to my brother in the corner over here, and then I'll come up front here.
Thank you so much. My name's Frederick Ogenga, Dr. Frederick Ogenga. I represent the Center for Media, Democracy, Peace and Security at Rongo University. I'm going to direct my question to Gnarnia. And this is because Kenya was lobbying so much to get off the ICC because it was a classic case of a president in waiting, being tried. And they produced, actually contributed some amount of money, some millions of Kenyan shillings, to a kitty called, towards the creation of the African Court. Mm-hmm. Of what use was this gesture, and how many countries do you think in Africa will support such a move? Because you're talking about Africa and the necessity to create their own version of ICC.
Okay, good morning. My name is Mr. Fritz Ganje. I'm with the University of Johannesburg. I have questions for Gustavo and Gnarnia.
Put yourself to one. I thought I heard questions in there.
Oh, okay, let me see who. I think I'll come to Gustavo later, or let me take Gnarnia. Gnarnia, I do get the point you're making, but I just want to ask you, South Africa's decision did not happen in a vacuum. There is a global political context. And I think we all know that that context has something to do with the very conditions that cause conflict on the continent. So could you please just move away from the legal argument and speak to the argument, the political argument that South Africa has made in relation to the global context that sometimes drives the conflict that we see on the continent. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Kidani Kiros. I'm the director of the Institute for Peace and Security Studies. I have two questions that are directed to Dr. Ibrahim Wani and Professor Gnarnia. The first question to Dr. Ibrahim Wani is that, well, when you talk about peacekeeping missions versus human rights, I agree that the civilian aspect and the police aspect should be part of the overall peacekeeping mission. But in some countries, there are different peacekeeping peacekeepers from different countries. So some of them, instead of, let alone protecting human rights in those countries, they are not able to protect themselves. They are being protected by other peacekeepers. Peacekeepers being protected by peacekeepers. So how is it possible to protect human rights in a situation where you have a peacekeeper that even does not protect itself? If I'm clear, I think you may understand what I'm trying to say. The second question goes to Professor Gnarnia. Well, the issue of ICC from the African's perspective, I think it's an issue of legitimacy. Say, for instance, it's like if you lose legitimacy in one state, whatever you do, no one accepts you, no one hears, no one listens. That is what's happening in reality when it comes to Africa. Well, there is another version of the narrative which says because African leaders are protecting themselves. I don't think that is the reality. The fact that there is no any regional or continental criminal court does not mean that ICC should maybe impose its own will, I can say. This is from the perspective of most of the Africans. So it's an issue of legitimacy. It lost its legitimacy, whether from those that are parties to the Rome Statute or not. So what do you think should be the solution? Because the recommendation that he gave does not, to my understanding, reflect the actual reality from the African's perspective. Thank you.
Okay, we'll let the speakers respond to this set of questions, and Professor Kidane, I'll let you sneak in 2 questions. I'm watching you now. So the first question really has to do with, given the sensitivities around the punishment of impunity, particularly at that very high level in Africa and on the continent, what are the chances of the success of creating an African-owned and African-driven court that's permanent to address these issues? That was the question from our colleague from Kenya. And then I think the second part of that question from Fritz had to do with you taking a step back, Gnarnia, and sort of looking at the political context, the global context behind why South Africa may have gone in the direction that it went with the ICC. And then a third part of the question on the ICC has to do with the ICC losing legitimacy on the African continent, and how you can begin to address some of those issues that led to that loss of legitimacy as a way of moving forward with what is a critical issue in the peacebuilding space. And for you, Dr. Wani, the question about how the composition of peacekeeping missions can sometimes create vulnerabilities in that space of peacekeeping and human rights protections. And Gustavo, I'll start with Gnarnia, obviously, since you got the hottest questions, and then work it this way. Gustavo, please feel free to chime in as we work our way down. So Gnarnia, over to you. You're in the hot seat.
Okay, yes. It's a hot potato. Frank, in terms of Kenya's lobbying, yes, this happened at the level of the African Union, where Kenya was lobbying to create an African court, so that the International Criminal Court wouldn't play this role on the continent. And the creation of the account, putting money towards this, that's very interesting. I am not aware of any other African country or even the African Union itself who is willing to invest large amounts of money in doing this. So that's one of the problems, that we can't have a vacuum on the continent, because that would just purely allow impunity. So if African countries do commit, if the AU does commit, put money towards the creation of an African criminal court, I think that would resolve some of the issues. Although it's a little bit difficult because of who it is who's wanting to do this as well. In terms of a leader who has been indicted to some extent, and so there's that sort of political discomfort as well. But it would be interesting to hear if any of the other African member states have actually contributed towards this fund. Fritz, you mentioned that the South African decision did not occur in a vacuum, and that's 100% correct. There's a regional context within which it took place, and people say, well, we have to work in a diplomatic manner dealing with these kinds of issues, and that we as Africans shouldn't be influenced by the West. I think because you're using the term global context, so I can only assume that you're referring to influences on the continent that come from the West. So I don't know if that assumes that the concept of human rights is a Western concept, which I would certainly not support, because we have to remember that the ICC came from situations where there were extreme human rights violations in Europe. And there was a reason for starting to focus on these kinds of atrocities. And that's one of the reasons why we have the ICC today. There were also arguments that there were South African soldiers in Sudan and nobody knew what was going to happen to them if the president was arrested. Quite frankly, I think the president should just not have been invited to the meeting. There's diplomatic channels behind the scenes that one could use to ensure that the president, al-Bashir, did not attend the meeting, because we had these obligations. And I'm sorry, but I can't put the rule of law aside when we've domesticated the Rome Statute. We can't go against our own domestic laws, or we're going to have chaos, right? So that's hopefully answering your questions, because I wasn't sure what you meant by the global context. And then perhaps you could correct me if I'm wrong. The legitimacy of the IEC, I really don't think that most Africans don't like the IEC. I've just mentioned a referendum in Zambia where 71% of the Zambian people decided that they wanted to Zambia to remain as a member state. Gambia, after the election, decided to reverse its decision to withdraw. And if there was this kind of like complete and utter lack of legitimacy of the ICC, why did African countries ignore Robert Mugabe's suggestion to withdraw en masse? It just didn't happen. And so the issue of legitimacy is at leadership level, not with the people of Africa. And I am African, so, I'm one of the Africans who thinks that there has been some effort to delegitimize the ICC, because we keep forgetting how many African judges there are there, that there is currently an African prosecutor there, that most of the cases were self-referred from the states themselves. So, you know, the whole issue of legitimacy, I've written a lot about this, and I would really challenge the assumption that most Africans do not accept the legitimacy of the courts.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Wani.
Thank you. Dr. Kidane's question on the capabilities of peacekeepers, a very, very valid, legitimate point. I didn't get to talk about it because it requires a whole seminar on its own. UN peacekeeping depends on countries volunteering as troop contributing countries. As you may have seen in the literature, extremely difficult to generate troops. In fact, the majority of peacekeeping missions operate at below capacity. There are only a handful of countries that regularly contribute: Ethiopia, Senegal, Uganda, and so on. Most of them African, perhaps India and Pakistan among them. Capability is varied. I have been in situations where the peacekeepers were the first to run, not only because they lack the necessary equipment, and it's a really serious situation on the ground, but also in some cases because they are not quite sure about the rules of engagement. When should they operate, when shouldn't they? Many of the countries put caveats and require that before they're able to undertake any kind of engagement with anybody who is threatening civilians, for example, on the ground, written instructions have to come from home. Rwanda does that, India does that, Pakistan does that. Now, if you imagine yourself in a situation where there's an imminent threat on civilians, obviously in this kind of situation, the peacekeeping mission is not going to be able to do that. And that's an issue that is acknowledged. And I think there are extensive discussions going on within the system to try to improve it. But unless there are drastic changes in the way the system functions today, I'm afraid it will continue to be the situation. It's actually quite a charade if you see what is going on the ground. I have had my own team of human rights investigators trying to go, and we are stopped at a roadblock with 4 or 5 soldiers carrying AK-47s because the troops that are escorting us are unwilling to go and counter the situation. And I don't blame them, because if you understand the dynamics and the context within which they operate, it's extremely difficult. Now, if I may chime in just one word on Dr. Ogenga's question. Here is where the pessimist in me comes out. I think there is no chance of an African criminal court coming into being anytime soon. I mean, if you look at the membership of the organization, the majority of them are serious human rights violators themselves. There is no way they are going to set up a court that will be trying them. And this is, I understand some of the arguments about double standards, Africans being targeted and what have you, but the reality also is that we really haven't reached that point when we demonstrate seriousness to address the human rights issues on the ground. Burundi has been going on for how long? There have been warnings about the potential for genocide on the ground. Has the African Union ever seriously taken that? The Peace and Security Council at one point came up with a resolution saying they needed to send troops on the ground. That was immediately quashed by the summit. And you know who introduced that resolution? It was Yahya Jammeh, prior to his being removed. So Gambia is an aberration. The reality is that we really do need a lot more serious conversation about human rights on the ground. And it's not a theoretical question, my friends. If you've been on the ground and seen the dead bodies, the issues of sexual violence and rape, children living in IDP camps in the most squalid conditions, you can't believe we're operating in the same century. So I sometimes get really, really irritated when I hear some of these theoretical arguments. You have to be on the ground to see what is happening to humanity. See what is happening to humanity on the ground, and then you will appreciate that we really need to take this as a matter of urgency. Our leaders are not serious. The African Union has a fantastic framework on paper, but it's not being operationalized at all. And I'm afraid even the African Union Commission is one of the failures in this regard. A lot of times they are the ones who are very timid and reticent to bring issues up to the summit to even consider. Thank you.
Okay then, Gustavo.
I just wanted to jump in on what Dr. Wani was talking about in terms of capacity of peacekeepers, because I think there's 3 elements into that, and Dr. Wani presented 2 very clearly. One is the capacity itself of the troop contributing countries and the ability of better training them to provide them with more capacity of being able to deploy and respond to the challenges on the ground. The second one, and both in terms of the UN and the African Union, there is a large doctrinal gap in terms of clarity around command and control, clarity around rules of engagement. The AU is starting a conversation now, which I think is a very positive conversation, around developing a doctrine not only in terms of the African standby force, but specifically in terms of what African peace support operations should have in terms of a doctrine. But the third one is actually a reflection on how troop generation actually happens. If we see the top 20 having majority of troop contributing countries being from Africa, and when you see about funding of peace operations, majority of the countries being from the developed countries, you certainly have a commitment gap, where developed countries are largely paying for peace operations, but not really doing the dirty work. They're not really doing the difficult work, and not really engaging with building the capacity. There is, of course, engagements of building capacity of African armies and troops to be able to deploy, but not really heavily participating as peacekeepers themselves, except China, which has, surprisingly, as the size of the country, a very large contingent deployed in peacekeeping operations. But unless we address those three issues in terms of the capacity of the troops themselves, the ability of having more clear doctrine and command and control, and resolving the commitment gap within the international community, we always still going to have challenges around how our peacekeepers are performing on the ground.
And that's a really, really important question, given that as of last month, I think 12 of the top 20 troop contributing countries were all African. That's a huge amount, with Africa accounting for just slightly under, I think, over 50% of all the troops to the UN peacekeeping missions. That doesn't even include the African missions, peacekeeping missions that are being run. So this is an important discussion and issues raised by both Dr. Wani and Gustavo that need a little bit more digging into and figuring out how we move ahead. Let me take another round of questions. Ooh, okay. Do I see anybody in the back? Okay, I'll do this. Let me take the gentleman right there. I'll work up to our Southern Voices people. So the gentleman in the white shirt, and then the gentleman in the blue shirt, and then Francois right here. And then I'll come for the next, I see you. I'll come for the next round.
Thank you. I'm a faculty member at Old Dominion University. Among other things, I teach conflict analysis and conflict resolution. I just wanted to ask Gustavo if he would, the case has been well made that prevention is very much effective. What is your analysis? What is your diagnosis? Why then there is very little prevention? Particularly, I'm not even thinking the political organizations, but organizations such as the Wilson Center and other places. Why is that there is no more effort by at least non-political organization to intervene?
Okay. Just one question. The gentleman in blue right in front there, about 2 rows up. Thank you.
Hi, yes. I'd like to ask Dr. Wani.
And who are you?
Oh, sorry, I'm an intern for the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. I'd like to ask Dr. Wani about, in terms of the peace-building architectures, how UN peacekeepers, I don't know that much about this, but I've read about sexual abuse that's going on at the hands of peacekeepers in places like the Central African Republic. What steps are, from your perspective as a human rights expert, are being taken to counter stuff like that?
Okay. And then the gentleman about 2 rows up in front, right there.
Thank you. I'm Professor Masabo Francois from University of Rwanda, the Center for Conflict Management. My question goes to Gustavo. Yeah, you have stressed the issue of effectiveness, but in my understanding, I think it is doubled by the issue of legitimacy. We see different levels of decision, regional economic communities, regional organization, AU, EU, and international UN Security Council. Really, we have a problem in some cases. We are questioned the level of legitimacy to take a decision. If we take the case of Libya, for example, different levels was competing. AU competing with the EU, and of course the UN and regional organizations. I'm wondering this challenge of legitimacy, who should be the first concerned by the decision to intervene?
Thank you.
Despite the issue of effectiveness and logistics.
All right, 3 very good questions. Again, I'll start this way with you, Gustavo. I think one was really a question about why is the prevention component of peace building so undervalued within the global and continental architectures, and obviously what do we do about it? The second one to Dr. Wani on sexual and gender-based violence in peacekeeping. And what steps can we take? How is that manifesting its steps? And what steps can we take to better address that issue? And then the third question actually from Francois was also to you, Gustavo, about the articulation of effectiveness and legitimacy at the global, continental, and sub-regional level in terms of how does that play out in practice and how does it impact peace building, and how really do we turn that around so that the people who are most affected at the pointy end of the spear when it comes to decision making. So Gustavo, you go first, and then I'll go to Dr. Wani, and if Gnarnia wants to chime in, she'll certainly be welcome.
Thanks very much, and thanks for those questions. And I think they really touch the core of some of the challenges that we have at the moment. I think the first question around the idea of why is it so difficult to bring prevention to the core? There's several reasons for that, but one of the most important for me is that the actors themselves really struggle to articulate clear interventions and responses around prevention. It's important that the UN Secretary General brings prevention to the core of all of his administration, but at the same time, when we start seeing what are the really real practical implications of that, we still see a bit more of the same. In the Security Council discussions, but also in the discussions around the peace-building architecture, conflict prevention is almost becoming a bit of everything. It's part of this embodied concepts that could mean anything and everything. And that really, I think, has a risk for reducing the effectiveness of the concept itself. So the United Nations Secretariat, the UN agencies and funds really need to start presenting far more clear direction for policymakers in terms of what they expect in terms of prevention. Because the other challenge with that is that it's much easier to identify prevention in a very operational way. It's easy to identify prevention in terms of mediation, in terms of a specific intervention, but it's much harder when we're talking about things like root causes of conflicts and long-term development. So linking better our responses to things like the Sustainable Development Goals and to long-term process is of critical importance for us to make prevention to be part of that. I think the question around legitimacy of different, who is the first responder, there is an interesting reflection process in Africa right now, because we often like talking about the tension between the AU and EU and AU and UN, but we should not forget the elephant in the room in Africa is that between AU and regional economic communities. If we get the case of Gambia, many would say if that situation had actually been dealt by the African Union, most likely we would still be trying to deal with that issue right now. But it also it raises a different question, and I think it creates almost a crisis of identity for the African Union itself. One of the main comparative advantages that we have of the African Union is that we identify the AU more often than not would have the legitimacy of responding, or the perceived legitimacy. But what do we do like in situations like in Burundi, where the Burundian government indirectly says that the AU doesn't have the legitimacy to actually be on the ground? So those questions, and it's not to say that the EU then is less important. The EU still remains a very important player. The regional economic communities still remain a very important player. But in different situations, different organizations will be better located to respond. And to some extent, we need to be able to acknowledge that this somehow confusion of different actors need to become better coordinated, that we need more clarity around what are our complementarities, maybe more than comparative advantages. There are complementary roles that different organizations can then play. Thanks.
Dr. Wani.
Thanks. On the issue of sexual abuse by peacekeepers, a very serious problem. Most missions do encounter that. I think it arises primarily because of the issues of power disparities and the desperate situation that civilians in countries in conflict tend to face. The UN has acknowledged the seriousness of the problem. I think the challenge is what exactly, and that's your question, what do you do about it? I think it does pose a very big dilemma. They've been talking a lot about being a little bit more selective on getting peacekeepers. I think that's a good start. But in view of the problem we talked about earlier and the difficulty of generating troops, that becomes quite a big issue. Your choices are quite limited. Secondly, of course, issues of training and sensitizing people better. Thirdly, the discipline dimension. What sanctions do you have to deal with people who engage in sexual violence? That's a very big problem for UN peacekeeping because, and this is related partly to the issue of command and control that Gustavo talked about earlier. It's a very awkward situation where the troops are actually accountable to their own countries. They're disciplined by their own troops. The UN as such doesn't really have much leverage or authority over them. So whenever there is an issue, you have to refer it back to the country concerned. So whatever mechanism you have within the UN, you leave it up to the sending country. And I must say, and again, I may sound a little rough and here, but most of the countries that send troops are not themselves exemplary countries. And so you have situations where if you allow then this country to be the one to create the proper code of conduct and to discipline their troops, I think you've got a very, very far distance. Thanks.
All right, we're fast running out of time. Gnarnia, did you want to say anything? Otherwise, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'll take 3 more comments from my SVNP colleagues here, but I'm going to ask that you please work with me. It's 30 seconds each. All right? Fritz, I've already had you. Let's give somebody else a chance. I'll come back to you in the next session. You know we have a whole day of sessions, right? All right. So let me go to Dr. Ozo, and then I'll work it this way. I'll come here and here. We'll see.
Thank you very much, Monde. I'm Dr. Nicholas Ozo from the African Technology Policy Studies Network. My question is to Dr. Wani. And when I listened to you, talked about tools for ensuring this peace building and for the peace building missions. And I was just wondering whether these tools are soft tools or hard tools. As a science and technology expert, I am keen to know exactly what tools you refer to, and so that we can interrogate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm Getachew from the Federal Meles Leadership Academy, Ethiopia. My question goes to Mr. Gustavo and Dr. Wani. I think you have touched about the partnership between the African Union and the United Nations, especially on peace building. Particularly, my focus is on the enforcement aspect. Is it partnership there? For instance, if you see from the legal and political perspective, for instance, the African Union Constitutive Act says that it is the African Union which has the priority on the African continent in terms of peace and security. When you see the United Nations chapter 8 says that it is the United Nations which has the priority to do on peace and security at the international level, and therefore there is some kind of controversies with regard to enforcement intervention in Africa. So from the legal point of view, there is controversies, and the same is true with the political one. So do you think this is really a big challenge in terms of maintaining peace and security in Africa? I have a question for Professor now, but I have to stop here. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, Gustavo, just to add to the debate on, my name is Chukwuemeka. I work for OneUp. To add to the debate on conflict prevention, I think one of the key challenges of conflict prevention is actually demonstration of results. And that's also what affects even those who invest in conflict prevention. But on African Union, I think there is an assumption that the RECs are the building blocks of the African Union, which also suggests that the pillars of that foundation are strong equally. And I don't think that's the case. So that in itself challenges African Union. The second one is, how do we begin to decongest or deconstruct the influence of the colonial legacies and its influence on countries who are affected by conflict? And how does African Union work within that terrain that is very, very difficult? And Mali, in my opinion, is a very good example.
All right. Another set of really, really good questions, comments, and insights. Dr. Wani, tools, the balance between soft and hard tools in that toolkit for peace building. What does that look like? Could you unpack it to a little bit more depth and give it a little bit more nuance?
Well, will you still continue?
I was going to, but it looks like you're ready to go.
I will wait.
All right. Dr. Getachu's comment on the tension between the AU and the United Nations on who has primary responsibility and therefore who takes the lead when it comes to intervention. Is that a real issue? Are we just manufacturing it? Or is that something that needs further attention? And if so, what would that attention be in terms of deconflicting that miscommunication or gap right now? And I think two very powerful points from our colleague from OneUp about the importance of demonstrating the results of peace building as something we always have to keep in the back of the mind, even as we conduct peace building, but also just looking at the roles of RECs, the regional economic communities, the articulation with the AU in terms of peace building, and because they provide that foundation, the building blocks. And then finally, this thing that just continues to loom over Africa, the role of former colonial powers in that peace and security space and the peace building space, and that how that continues to play out today, some 50 plus years after independence, and how you begin to deconstruct that colonial legacy so we can move forward. So I think what I'm going to do is I'll start with Dr. Wani. You're next in the hot seat, and then I'll come over to Gustavo, and then Gnarnia, if you have some comments. Dr. Wani.
Thank you. Dr. Oza, I think, raises a very, very important point. And I'm sorry, talking as a lawyer, social scientist, I was not quite talking tools in the hard sense of the word. Although in some respects, of course, you may need to resort to weapons and things like that to address the issue of human rights. My primary question here really is, what do we do when there are violations of human rights? When you have these very serious situations where either a government in power or during a conflict with an armed group contesting the government's authority, or perhaps even just armed militias, as in the case of Sierra Leone, going on committing human rights violations with abundance. What are you able to do? The kinds of things we do normally, the issuance of reports, we do monitoring and investigation. In some cases, unfortunately, the Human Rights Council in Geneva, when I was director for Africa, the refrain from Africa always was, we need training. Come on, train us a little bit more. I said, unfortunately, I don't think capacity is what you lack. Maybe you have a little too much of. So the primary point I was really raising here is, what do we do when, as concerned citizens or members of the international community or institutions, we are confronted with these serious violations of human rights? Is there anything beyond issuing reports, perhaps sending emissaries to go and talk to the leaders, having the threat of the ICC hovering over them? What more can you do? And I think the experience that we have had in the work of human rights over the last 10, 20 years is that when you are presented with those really, really difficult situations, unfortunately, I don't think we have much in our toolbox. Sorry to go back to tools again. There isn't much that we're able to do. And part of what I was saying simply is that we do need to think a little bit more, perhaps considering also the issue of the use of force. Yeah, in the case of the DRC, for example, at one point they established this rapid reaction force with the idea that because of the nature of the situation on the ground, we should be able to resort to that if necessary. And indeed, one of the more recent developments is that human rights violations have been determined in some instances to be a threat to international peace and security. Should that then be a basis to invoke Chapter 7 of the UN Charter in order to trigger international action to deal with violations of human rights on the ground? So those are the issues that I was talking about, not necessarily having any kind of mechanical things on the ground that you would be able to use. And if I may, on this issue of the AU-UN or perhaps sub-regional organization relationship, technically, yes, by law, the Constitutive Act contradicts the Charter of the United Nations in that regard. But I think in practice, they've come up to, it seems, developing towards a very decent accommodation now. As you may know, the UN has opened an office in Addis Ababa dealing directly with the African Union, and the primary reason for that is to be able to improve on the issues of collaboration and coordination, and to the extent possible also support in the area of capacity. My concern is actually quite the opposite, that this deference to sub-regional, regional organization in some respects undermines international action because we keep postponing. I mean, I take the case of South Sudan, for example. I think that it is quite a mistake to be leaving it up to IGAD. IGAD doesn't have the capability and the political will and the resolve to deal with the situation. But every time the issue comes up, the UN says, oh, no, it is the African Union. African Union says it is IGAD to deal with that. So we step back. It's now 3 years. At what point are you going to say, OK, you've tried, you've reached your limit, it's now for us to come in? That becomes quite a serious problem.
Thanks. I was told I only have 1 minute, so I'm going to be very simplistic in my answer, so I'm apologizing about that already. But I think I can merge some of those questions to talk about this issue about partnerships, both between the UN and the AU, but also the idea of subsidiarity within the African continent. I agree with Dr. Wani, and while I acknowledge there is a often very difficult relationship between the UN and the AU, I don't see quite much of the tension between the two organizations in terms of when to choose to deploy. If we get, for instance, the case of Somalia, the AU is the only organization willing and able to deploy, not in terms of just capacity of its own peacekeepers, but for political ability of doing this. 10 years ago, the big discussion in the Security Council was whether the UN could take over from the AU in Somalia. And the political discussion was that, no, we don't have really the conditions that would enable the Security Council to deploy. So I think most often than not, what is starting to happen is a kind of an informal division of labor between the AU and the UN, where the spaces in which the AU deploys are generally, not always, quite different to spaces that the UN would deploy. And then we can talk more about this separately. But I think this also talks about the different visions and how I see some different views around what subsidiarity means in Africa. I think from an African Union point of view, and this is maybe from an African Union Commission point of view, what I often see is the idea of subsidiarity, of the building blocks is this umbrella arrangement where the AU is on top and the regions are kind of like filtering through and creating this kind of structure. From a lot of the regions, from what I see, you have the other way around. The idea of subsidiarity is far more seen as complementarity, and especially in stronger regions like West Africa, where ECOWAS, to a large extent, has as much or more capacity of intervening than the African Union has. Therefore, it often makes far more sense for the region to intervene because of its own regional capacity. And finally, very briefly on the idea of decolonization, because I think it's very important to talk about the issue around how the African Union engages with external partners. Because when we talk about the idea that the African Union needs to take more ownership, there is the key question around funding of the African Union structures. If we're still reliant on external partners, is what a colleague from the AU Commission often says, you create strategic conditionalities. And therefore, the discussion around creating a far more shared responsibility between African member states that would increase the funding to the African Union, but also ensuring that the United Nations has a role to play in funding peace operations in Africa. And it's not because the United Nations should be nice to Africa, but it's because this is an international responsibility to deal with peace and security in the continent. Therefore, we're dealing with the different issues. But it's certainly something that AU heads of states have to be far more conscious and actually be able to be more forward-looking in terms of how they empower their own organization.
Gnarnia, you have 1 minute.
Yeah, I don't know if that was 1 minute, Gustavo.
No, it wasn't. That's on me. The police officer here failed miserably, but you have 1 minute.
I'll try, Wendy. Yeah, I think I probably didn't answer Fritz's question properly, but I will talk. And the tools that we have at our disposal would be strong judiciary within the countries themselves, and we would have referral to the International Criminal Court as one of the tools. And if we don't have that tool, then what else is there? You know, what else can we do with abuse of power on the continent? So my argument is, if we don't like it, then we've got to commit to creating a court on the continent, our own courts. But the problem is that most probably isn't going to happen because there are so many leaders who are afraid of losing power and who are afraid of being held accountable for abuses under their rule. So I don't think it's an easy situation, but it is one that we need to keep thinking about in terms of how we interact with the International Criminal Court.
All right, so a really, really good session, and I'm really sorry to have to bring it to an end. I don't know that I can even do justice to all the key and important issues that our speakers have brought out. But here's some of the key issues that I'm taking away from this session, just very quickly before we close here. That peace building is often perceived to be a linear process where we can neatly and conveniently break down the prevention aspect, the management of conflict, and then the post-conflict of reconstruction. And that but when we look at it in that linear way, it undermines our responses and our ability to do real effective peace building. Now, what we really need to do is to understand the articulation between these different phases, to sequence things properly within that broader context. The second thing that I'm taking away from this discussion is that when you break down the peace building continuum, in too many of the international and continental level peace building architectures and institutions, the prevention aspect of it is undervalued and under-resourced. And therefore, how do we then begin to think about how we shift resources and attention to also taking care of that prevention aspect of the peace building equation? The third issue that I'm taking away from Gustavo's presentation has to do with a very reactive response to peace issues in general. That we tend to wait until something has happened and then we initiate our response. And we miss many opportunities by taking that very reactive response to working on peace building issues. Gustavo talked about the importance of identifying the benchmarks for success, the importance of proper sequencing and timing, and really implored us to look at the very limited reach and the consequences, therefore, of both the UN and the AU peace building architecture in general and how we move forward to fix that. Then there's this big elephant in the room that we often don't talk about, which is the fact that both the AU and the UN can only be as successful as its member states allow them to be. And therefore, the importance of member states empowering these organizations to do the missions with which they have been tasked, and in this regard, in the peacebuilding space. Dr. Wani, I really like that you started off with some of the positives around human rights in the peacebuilding context. The very strong strides that we have taken in the policy and normative frameworks around human rights issues. But I think you pointed out through your various interventions the gap in operationalizing that normative framework, those standards, and bringing them to life in the field, and that this is an area that we need to focus on. You also talked, and this is a very real issue, I think, for many Africans, because Africans are bearing a disproportionate burden, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of generating troops for peacekeeping missions, if you look at it within that global context. You talked about the challenges of generating troops, but also the piling on that we have had in terms of what peacekeeping missions are expected to do, and the negative consequences of that piling missions, you know, the many tasks, the short time frame in which we are asking the peacekeepers to do the work, the very important work that they have to do. So how do you unpack this really crowded peacebuilding and peacekeeping agenda? You talked about the lack of convergence and agreement on what we mean by human rights. Obviously, if there's no agreement on what we're talking about, whether it's at the African level or the broader international context, then you're going to have challenges in how best you safeguard human rights if you're not agreeing on what human rights mean. But you also pointed out the fact that in the same way that the prevention aspect of peacebuilding is undervalued, that human rights are not embraced under the African peace and security architecture. And that's a real deficit there that needs a little bit more attention. I won't go into the tools issue because we talked a lot about that just here towards the end. Gnarnia talked about this false dichotomy between peace and justice, and how the ICC then fits into that. Obviously, a really hot potato on the African continent, but I think a powerful message that I'm leaving with is that if we value political expediency over the safeguarding of human rights and the protection of human rights, Africa is going to continue to struggle with this issue of human rights. We talked about the gap of a permanent mechanism for addressing impunity on the African continent. And Gnarnia's position obviously is that having this deficit on the African continent means the ICC is what we have, and we really ought to be looking at how do we make the ICC more effective. There was a bit of a disagreement on just African perspectives on the ICC. And I think in unpacking that disagreement, I think one of the issues that we now need to look at is it appears that although African leaders or some African leaders are pushing back on the ICC, that ordinary African citizens perhaps view things differently. They want an ICC or an ICC-like mechanism that can hold leaders accountable. So how do we bridge that disconnect to move forward to make sure that Africa is addressing this impunity? The last point here that we have on who has primary responsibility for upholding peace and security globally and on the African continent. Is it the AU? Is it the African Union? And how do the RECs fit into all of that? I think that's a really good point, but let me just say that I think one of the key points that I heard is that sometimes the RECs ought to take primary responsibility depending on what the issue is, sometimes the AU, sometimes the UN. But I will say, I think a subtext to what we were discussing here is that we have seen a development, I think, in the international dialogue of sometimes when it is convenient for the international community to put up the African solutions to African problems when the international community does not want to take action. and that is not serving us well. So you get this circular finger pointing of who is responsible. Is it the UN? Is it the AU? Is it the Rex? And in the meantime, there are real life consequences, a la South Sudan, Central African Republic, you name it. These are the real issues that we're dealing with. So please, please join me in thanking our three speakers for a wonderful, wonderful session. We are now going to go in for a reception. We have the out in the atrium here. Then we have the second event starting at 11:15 on elections and peace building in Africa. So thank you very much for your contributions. We look forward to seeing as many of you as possible in the next session.
Thanks, appreciate it. Good, good. Listening to Gustavo. Excellent, very good. Yeah.
Thank you. Let me get my.
As you say,
Can I have you guys
what's
here?
going on.